English history is littered with questionable kings, from the psychotic to the downright inept. But there's one king that stands out to me as the worst, John Lackland, also known as King John of England. But why have I chosen him? Well, he managed to turn the entire Avignon Empire into a smoking ruin, alienate almost everyone who mattered, and may have lost the crown jewels in the wash. But there's so much more to look at than that. Let's get right into it. Twelfth century England was an interesting place. John's father, Henry II, had become King of England after a period of nearly 20 years of civil war. And if we look at John's family, well, how do I put it nicely? They were dysfunctional. The future King John was the youngest of Henry II's 8 children, with the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman so powerful that she ruled more land than the King of France before she even married Henry. She was also the ex-wife of the King of France, also named Henry. He had divorced her because they'd not been able to have children. The young Henry saw the most eligible woman in Western Europe was single and swooped in. Both highly political, she saw in him a fantastic opportunity in this short, broad-shouldered and incredibly enthusiastic young king. She and Henry proved Henry VII of France very wrong. Henry was a skilled and powerful young ruler, outplaying his relation Stephen to become the King of England. He stabilized and grew his lands and territory, and now proved that he could start a large family. Embarrassingly for Henry VII, as Eleanor went on to have 5 sons and 3 daughters with their fecund young king. John was born in 1166, a late addition to the family. His eldest brother had died in infancy, but he was overshadowed for much of his young life by his older brothers. You could say his siblings were a lineup of medieval overachievers, including Henry, the young king, a golden boy with a huge amount of promise. He was crowned sub-king of England, meaning one day he would be king, and he was meant to have power attached to this. The issue was that he was hapless, and the later chroniclers described him as lacking in every field and easily manipulated. Henry II likely saw this. He never managed to gain any powers from his father, who held onto control of his lands with a steel grip. Henry died young after rebelling against his dad, taken by the least chivalric of all deaths, dysentery. Richard the Lionheart, Eleanor's favourite, a crusading legend with poor financial skills. He didn't care for England, following in his mother's footsteps and desiring Aquitaine, as well as honour and fame in war. He inherited his father's martial prowess and a temper to match. Geoffrey of Brittany was a schemer. He seems to have inherited his mother's political mind, a close friend of the Prince of France, with an unfortunate talent for dying in tournaments before his schemes could mature. And then John. Poor John. Even as a kid, he was nicknamed Lackland because he was expected to inherit nothing. And even worse, he got this nickname from his father. Ugh. The empire his father ruled was an interestingly stitched-together one, built by conquest in the case of Brittany, marriage in the case of Aquitaine was Eleanor's land, and inheritance, England, Normandy and Anjou came from his ancestors. To make matters harder as well, we come to the issue of medieval feudalism, where the lands in France were feudal holdings that Henry II held as a vassal of the King of France. A king could hold lands in another country, where he was a lord with responsibilities to another monarch, making a complex web of alliances and precarious relationships. In fact, it was believed that Henry would divide his lands amongst his sons, with Henry the young king most likely receiving England, Normandy and Anjou, Geoffrey receiving Brittany, Richard receiving Poitou and control of Aquitaine from his mother. This, while not keeping the empire together as we may understand it in a modern sense, would have ensured that his dynasty would have had control of his lands, and with a lot of hope, kept his heirs as allies. Let's go back to John. Don't feel too bad for him just yet. Henry II actually liked John, which is surprising given the Plantagenet tradition of sons betraying their fathers. Henry gave John lands, titles, and even made him the Lord of Ireland. Of course, John managed to mess that up too, but we'll get there. The idea of sending a child off from its mother in the modern day is one that would shock most of us. This is not the case for a medieval royal. Once he had survived his first few weeks of life, John was sent off with a wet nurse and a magister, or what we today would call a teacher, and his older sister Joan to Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou, as a part of the heartlands of Henry II's dynasty. Today it still exists and is near Sinon in the Loire Valley. John and Joan were close, which would have been a mercy for the young prince. Once he was old enough, his education was transferred to Ranulph de Granville, who was one of the most important English civil servants in the north. Later, he would fall foul of Richard I's temper following Henry II's death. It was likely expected that John would be given a role in the church or in the civil service, supporting one of his older brothers within the kingdom. He joined Henry the young king's household, gaining experience in warfare, hunting, and the skills of court, vital for a young lord. Physically, he resembled his father, short but broad, being only 5'5", but being powerful and broad-chested with his father's dark red hair. John's passions give us some more idea of his character. For example, his hobbies: he enjoyed reading and had a library, hunted more than most of his contemporaries, and enjoyed ambient music. His vices, though, were much better known. The French mocked him for his enjoyment of bad wine. He gambled and had a greed for anything extravagant, from clothing to jewels, which he had a huge collection of. He was known to be witty and generous, but was easily offended and very, very oversensitive, exploding into a fit of rage easily, where he would bite and gnaw at his fingers. He had his family's famous Plantagenet temper. Now, this upbringing doesn't sound ideal, but it doesn't sound like the upbringing of an awful ruler. But this story is just getting started. From here, it's only downward for John. Political marriages were essential to a medieval world. John was as much a resource to his family as he was a son. He was betrothed Alice, the daughter of Humbert III of Savoy, which would have meant that Savoy, Piedmont, and other possessions of his father-in-law would have ended up in his family's control, further boxing in the King of France. Henry II granted him castles in Aquitaine when he was just 5. Unfortunately, this drove a wedge between him and his brother Henry the young king, and also his mother Eleanor, who felt she should have been consulted about changes in her duchy. It also led his sons to revolt against him. Henry II won the revolt of John's brothers in 1173, but he did not punish his sons for their revolt, rather seeing Eleanor as the reason why they had revolted against him, and he imprisoned her. Alice made her way to meet John, but she died before they met, and John was again back on the market to be married off. His father also looked more favourably on John, as he had not revolted against him, and he was granted lands at the cost of his English and French lords. John was made the Earl of Cornwall. Henry found another heiress, Isabella of Gloucester, giving her all of her sister's inheritance, and thereby making the newly betrothed couple fabulously wealthy. The most impressive gift, though, was the Lordship of Ireland, given to the 10-year-old John in 1177, highlighting Henry's favouritism to his son, despite John being the least amongst his brothers for inheritance. When John was 16, his brothers Henry the Young King and Richard the Lionheart declared war on each other over their inheritances in England, Normandy and Aquitaine, testing their muscles against one another and preparing for the day when their father would pass. This was not unusual, as the sons of William the Conqueror were happy to murder and imprison each other. Henry II supported Richard in this conflict, which turned out to be the right choice, as Henry the Young King died of dysentery, and his hopes of being King of England went down the toilet. This again shows that the weapons of war were not the only risks to campaigning. A cup of water from a river or a dirty well could be just as deadly to these young nobles as any sword, spear or arrow. The order of inheritance was now Richard as King of England, no change for Geoffrey in Brittany, and John benefited greatly as he would be Duke of Aquitaine. Richard was not happy that he would lose Aquitaine. Due to being his mother's favourite, he likely felt the greatest connection with it, and as John for so long had been without any inheritance, Richard felt that he should keep both England and Aquitaine. Henry did not agree, and with all the rage of the Plantagenet bloodline, ordered John and Geoffrey to take Aquitaine from their brother, attacking his capital of Poitiers while Richard counterattacked Brittany. Like many wars of this period, it came to nothing, and there was a reconciliation between the brothers and father in 1184. When John first set foot in Ireland at the age of 18, he had one job: impress the Anglo-Irish nobles and establish his rule. And let me tell you, this did not go well. 300 knights and a host of administrators joined him as he set out to claim a kingdom his father had granted him. Any medieval king would be looking to make allies, develop friendships, and build a lasting base for his rule within his lands. Instead, he insulted their customs, mocked their beards, and tensions flared. He left quickly with his tail between his legs. To make it even worse, the Viceroy of Ireland took the fall for him. Hugh de Lacy was blamed for the fact the Lords of Ireland had not welcomed him with open arms. Not exactly a promising start for any future king. This was only the start of a trend in John's behaviour. His bizarre decisions only got worse as he gained more power. Ireland was only the first of many places to experience the full John Lackland treatment. By the time he actually came to be king in 1199, his reputation was already a mixture of greed, cruelty, and incompetence, but things were about to get much worse. John again benefited from the death of a family member. His brother Geoffrey was across in Paris, plotting with Philip, the son of the King of France. The two princes met under the guise of a jousting tournament to plot against Henry II. Unfortunately for Geoffrey, he was unhorsed and killed during the tournament, and his plots came to nothing. Geoffrey's son Arthur was now the Duke of Brittany, but now there were only two Plantagenet princes left, and everything on the table to inherit. Richard the Lionheart was the elder, but had revolted against his father, something that Henry took very personally. He was now worried that if he went on crusade, something he was desperate to do, his father would disinherit him. Richard looked to Philip II of France to make a deal. Philip would support Richard in his rebellion as long as Richard swore allegiance to him for his French holdings. John likely hoped that Richard would die or be disinherited, leaving him to inherit the whole empire. Richard and Philip declared war. Young and dynamic, they managed to push back Henry, the heavyweight king. It was only when he saw his father was about to lose that John changed sides. This broke his father. He surrendered, recognized Richard as his heir, and died shortly afterwards. Some say that he died of a broken heart from the betrayal of his most beloved son. On his father's death, John was in a difficult position. He was only saved by his brother's desire to go on crusade. Richard wanted to be a crusader and needed a huge amount of money to finance this. To secure his position as king, he gave John the county of Mortain, allowed for his marriage to Isabella of Gloucester, as well as lands in Cornwall, Derby, Devon, Dorset, Nottingham and Somerset. John would have all of this as long as he did not enter England for 3 years, hopefully giving Richard enough time to go to the Holy Land and return. When Richard went on crusade, he appointed magistrates, but they didn't do a very good job of ruling in his absence. Eleanor requested to Richard that John would be allowed to return to England and help with the stability of the realm. Almost immediately, John set himself up as a rival ruler, using the disorder caused by the poor magistrates to argue that he would be better placed to rule. This led to an armed conflict that John won, driving his enemies into the Tower of London and asking the citizens of London to recognise him as Richard's true heir. It almost looked too good to be true for John until the news arrived that Richard had got married in Cyprus. John again could be knocked out of the ladder of inheritance if Richard managed to produce an heir. Philip II of France again became the solution to any rebellious prince. The man who had been the thorn in Henry II's side and Richard's ally now became John's ally. Eleanor stopped him, but John was chewing at the bit. His brother had been gone for some time now, and he could be dead. What was stopping him from claiming his brother's throne? In time, it became clear that Richard had been captured by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI and had been held for ransom. John was overjoyed and reached out to Philip for an alliance. Here was the deal. If John would put aside his wealthy wife Isabella and instead marry Philip's sister Alice, Philip would support him in a war. John agreed, and war broke out with Richard's supporters. But John had poorly calculated again. He lacked support, and when Richard was released in 1194, John's final supporters surrendered. Rather than banishing his brother, Richard mocked him by forgiving him and saying that he was a child who had evil counsellors. Removing all of his lands outside of Ireland, this must have been a real sting to John, as he was 27, a brutal put down by his brother. John caused no more trouble for Richard for the remainder of his reign, joining Richard's campaigns against Philip II to restore their lands in France and expand their power. John was a capable war leader. Richard appreciated John's support and restored him as Count of Gloucester and Mortain. Richard seemed to be in a very strong position, married with a loving wife, with successes in the Crusades and wars in France. He just needed to produce a male heir or for Arthur to come of maturity, and the empire would be secure. Like many periods of history, it came down to a single event. Richard's success was not to last. While sieging Chalus-Chabrol, he was shot by a crossbow bolt, fired by a chef who had come to give rations to the defenders on the walls. He died of an infection on the 6th of April, 1199. When John inherited the throne, he ruled one of the largest empires in Europe. The Avignon Empire stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, including England, Normandy, and Aquitaine. But there was one big problem: feudal politics. You see, much of this land wasn't really owned by John. It was held in feudal allegiance to the King of France. And the King, Philip II, was practically licking his chops when John came to power. Why? Because John, shall we say, was not great at making friends. His nephew, Arthur of Brittany, was considered a valid claimant to the French lands, and Philip pressed his claims. While John was crowned king in England, he had to fight Philip in France, relying on exhausting Philip with expensive sieges and waiting for the Pope to intervene to bring peace. Philip eventually had to recognize him as Richard's heir for his French lands. John had secured peace, though this had earned him the unfavourable nickname of Soft Sword by medieval chroniclers, as he was not willing, as Richard was, to fight wars for war's sake. Within 5 years, John had lost almost all of his French territories, including Normandy, the ancestral homeland of his family. And the way he did it? By alienating and offending everyone around him. Within 2 years, John had put aside his wife Isabella of Gloucester to marry Isabella of Angoulême. John's argument was that Isabella G was his cousin, and he should have asked the Pope for permission to marry her, which he hadn't. She also had not provided him with any children, although he had produced illegitimate children elsewhere. First he married Isabella of Angoulême, who was already engaged to another noble, Hugh IX of Lusignan. His lands of Poitou were key supply lines for the Aquitaine, and his brother was a key part of the border defences of Normandy. This was not a good move for John, because Hugh and his brother rose against him. Again, rather than John honouring and making friends and giving them gifts or land, titles or money, and then making them friends for his cause, he showed them a total lack of tact. He treated them with contempt and crushed their revolt. This led them to appeal to Philip as John's feudal overlord for a resolution for the treatment they had received. Philip outplayed and humiliated John diplomatically, and because of John's stubbornness, Philip declared war, stating that all of John's French lands were revoked and belonged to Arthur, and Normandy would be his. John started the war by avoiding battle and relying on Normandy's strong defensive positions, but Philip began to have successes in his eastern territories, and Arthur was in a position to capture Eleanor of Aquitaine at Mirabeau Castle. John had to rush to defend his mother, and in doing so he managed to ambush Arthur and most of his commanders. A win for John! Unfortunately again, John's character was his greatest enemy. He abused his prisoners and ignored his ally William de Roches, who had supported him greatly during the war, and was rightly offended by the king's slights. John showed horrific cruelty to his prisoners and put them in such horrendous conditions that 22 of the rebel leaders died in captivity. While medieval warfare allowed you to kill and destroy peasant villages, the nobility expected a certain level of treatment, even if they revolted against you. As most of the lords in his forces were related in some way to the captured prisoners, many had lost family members, and his own commanders were furious at him. William de Roches, once his ally, now joined Philip, and Brittany rose in revolt against John. John was also cash-strapped, while Philip had the whole of France's revenue to draw on. In 1203, John was starting to panic. He tried to convince the Pope to intervene in the war to bring it to a stalemate again, but this failed. Raging with anger, he made his way to Rouen, where he had Arthur kept in his castle. He got drunk and strangled his nephew, attaching his body to a stone and throwing him into the Seine. This king-slaying again weakened his position, and Arthur's sister Eleanor was kept imprisoned for years afterwards by John. The war continued to go badly. While he showed tactical skill, Philip ignored him. John harried Brittany to try and draw him away, but Philip simply ignored him and continued to assault Normandy. John's character stopped him from holding together an alliance. In March of 1204, his mother died. By 1204, Philip had taken Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine's lords were questioning John's right to rule. John had lost the lands of his ancestors, William the Conqueror, and his father, Henry II, due to his own actions and character. The Avignon Empire was in ash. Not exactly the stuff of legends, is it? Now, if losing half your empire wasn't bad enough, John also picked a fight with the Pope. In 1207, John refused to accept the Pope's choice for Archbishop of Canterbury, which led to England being placed under interdict. Translation: no church services, no weddings, no funerals, only baptisms for infants and confessionals for the dying were allowed. The whole kingdom was basically in a religious lockdown. But this is the thing, John loved it. He used the interdict as an excuse to confiscate church lands and pocket their income. He even joked about Jesus' resurrection being unlikely. Yes, really. By 1209, he was excommunicated. Did he care? Not one bit. He confiscated the lands of the priests who sided with the Pope and collected church wealth. He gained 14% of the annual income of the church, £67,000 in 1209, or £115 million in today's money, from the vacant church properties. Eventually, in 1213, John came to terms with the Pope and offered an annual feudal service of £700 or 1.23 million to the Pope and compensation for any losses during the crisis. From then on, the Pope supported John against Philip and his barons. Understandably, John did not repay his debt to the church, and 2/3 of what he owed was never returned. And then we come to John's crowning humiliation, the Magna Carta. In 1214, John tried again to reclaim Normandy, making alliances with the Holy Roman Emperor, Flanders, and Boulogne. His lords, though, refused to fulfill their military service, and he became reliant on mercenaries. The war went badly, and his allies were defeated. John was forced to give Anjou to Philip, and the Plantagenet heartlands were taken from him. In 1215, John's barons, especially the northern ones, finally had enough of his taxes, his arbitrary justice, and his cruelty. There were rumours John preyed on their wives and took them as mistresses. His northern lords especially did not like him. John offered reforms, but this was to buy time. He sent a letter to the Pope for support and was recruiting mercenaries in Poitou. He even went as far to declare that he wished to become a crusader. He would be provided with legal protections against his vassals revolting against him if he did. The rebels gathered in Northampton, led by Robert Fitzwalter, an influential baron. They marched on London, taking the capital. The barons met at Runnymede near Windsor Castle on the 15th of June 1215 and created the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, which reformed the rights of freemen, protected the church, created protections against illegal imprisonment, enshrined quick justice, and ensured there needed to be consent for taxation. But guess what John did as soon as he signed it? That's right, he tried to wriggle out of it. Within months, he was at war with his barons, and England was plunged into chaos. Fun fact, the Magna Carta later inspired democratic constitutions around the world. As with most of his wars, John started in a better position, better defended castles, with more experienced troops and huge wealth in comparison to his barons. He also had loyal troops at his side. He had success against Alexander II of Scotland, but was unable to stop the spread of the revolt, and Prince Louis of France, Philip II's son, landed on the south coast. Many of the rebels suggested that he should be proclaimed King of England, as his wife had a claim on the throne. She was a granddaughter of Henry II. While it seemed difficult, John had turned the tide before with his experience, mercenaries, and ruthless power. But it was not to be, and like his brother before him, he caught dysentery. In 1216, as the Civil War raged on, John made one last epic blunder. While retreating across the Wash, a tremendous tidal estuary, he lost his baggage train, which allegedly included the royal crown jewels. Some say they sank into the mud and were never recovered. Was this true? Who knows, but it's a fitting metaphor for John's reign: messy, bogged down, and ultimately doomed. By October, John was in the undesirable position of being in a stalemate with the rebels, suffering dysentery and faced with the prospect of a long war. He was likely exhausted. He arrived in Newark Castle on the 18th of October and passed away. His most loyal troops, his mercenaries, took his body to Worcester Cathedral, where he was buried in front of the altar, leaving behind a 9-year-old son, Henry III, and a kingdom in shambles. But here's the twist. John's reign, for all his disasters, also paved the way for some surprising positives. The Magna Carta, for one, became a cornerstone for constitutional law, and John's administrative reforms, although hated, helped England develop one of the most effective tax systems in medieval Europe. So in a weird way, his failures set up the stage for future success. So was John England's worst king? Almost certainly. Rageful and cruel to those who did not please him, with unreasonable favoritism to those who provided him with support and finances, lustful and abusive to his barons' wives, as well as being sacrilegious, but being happy to abuse the support that religious leaders could provide. He was a strong military commander with innovative ideas, but again destroyed any advantage that he had by being unable to create positive relationships. His story is a reminder that even bad leaders can leave behind important legacies, whether they mean to or not. John's mistakes led to a recognition that the system of kingship was open to abuse, and this could not be tolerated. Future kings and queens would have to rule by consent far more than he had done. If you've enjoyed this video, you should check out my recent series on the Border Reivers, the fascinating clans of rebels that had kings fearing them. I do have a link tree in the description if you would like to support me further. Until then, keep loving history and learning from the past.